This episode is presented by Mercury, the fintech that simplifies how more than 200,000 businesses operate.
Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. Today is Friday, December 27th. I'm Kirsten Korosec, and joining me today are my fellow TCers, Devin Coldewey, Margaux MacColl, and Anthony Hall, who I just said Hall for some reason. I'm not really sure what's going on
That's
there.
happened to me before, but I've
I don't know
never
why. I think of the MacColl into the Hall, like I just
Anthony
kept
Michael
going.
Hall. Isn't that a guy?
Oh, yeah. Anthony Michael Hall, though. So
I'll take it.
a little different.
I'll take it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, because it's the last Friday of 2024, we're going to do something a little bit different than our usual end of week episode. Instead, we're going to focus on trying to review the whole year, if that's possible. I want to start by putting Devin on the spot and asking, what was your favorite story to write this year and your favorite story to read?
Boy, I was actually not prepared for this question. Can you come back to me or ask me again?
Yeah. Okay, I will start. How about that? There are three stories or sort of like big stories that we covered that kind of spring to mind. And one was like Sean's basically like 9 months of investigation. And really it's been years into Fisker. And he was just kind of like on top of this story from the very beginning. But he did have a story that looked at like every issue within the company, basically the inside story of its demise, which was amazing, really great reporting. And then I loved Rebecca Balan, who's been on this show. She looked into what happened to kind of like a not very well-known e-bike startup called Onyx, but its founder died and sort of what happened and sort of the tumult that has occurred since then. It was just a really great story. And then outside of my team, I loved Sarah Perez's story about Sam Altman and catapulting past founder mode into God mode with latest AI post, which was not a scoop, but it was just so fun and amazing that I have to mention it. So, Devin, back to you.
My favorite thing is definitely, I met these guys at Space Symposium. Well, this one guy, Aaron, he used to be in Made in Space, and he started this new company called Max Space with this guy, Maxim de Jong, who's been in making space habitats, like in orbit habitats, since like the 80s. He's been working with Sierra Nevada and stuff, and they're making a new company with a totally new type of inflatable or expandable space habitat. And he's a fascinating guy. We had this great conversation about all kinds of things, and like the guy came across this like fabulous idea for how to make a better like in space habitat, and was like, "I'm a genius." And then he found out that Bernoulli, a 17th century French mathematician, had already basically figured it out. So he was like, well, that was humbling. But it's a fascinating story of how they ended up putting this company and this new type of like space technology together. I had a really fun time writing. I hope I get to talk to Maxim again.
Cool. What about Anthony or Margaux? Any last ones to add?
I mean, this is a little bit of a repeat, but I thought Maxwell Zeff's piece about AI advertising was really great. And it also infuriated me because I wanted to write that story, but he did it first and he did it better than I would have. And so I really resent him for that. I would also shout out something, since we're just thinking about the past year in terms of writing about tech, it's not a TechCrunch piece, but this piece in the New Yorker by the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, why AI isn't going to make art. That was like an essay that actually like made me really emotional and made me think about sort of what I value and I think push back against a lot of the predominant narratives in AI that I found really moving and thought-provoking.
Amazing piece by Ted Chiang. Love that.
Yeah, I was going to say the first piece I wrote when I came here a few months ago was I went to the RNC, which was really fun. And also just felt like that's a story that I go back to a lot and I think about a lot because I think being at the RNC and being around those people ended up being very prescient. Yeah, I reread that one every now and then and I think, huh.
Yeah, the timing there was, I'm not going to say serendipitous because it was planned, but certainly will bode well for future reporting, I think. Well, the other thing I wanted to sort of address is not just all the stories, but also all the change that has happened this year in the tech world and at TechCrunch, even here at Equity. So I wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to listeners who have stuck around during all of our musical hosting chairs and thank Anthony, Devin, and Margaux. And let us know, give us some feedback of what you want to see or hear, I guess I should say, in the new year. So without further ado, we're going to scrap the whole deal of the week and we're going to call it Deal or No Deal. We're going to spotlight some startups and then we're going to talk about our favorite thing. Devin, get ready. AI advancement.
Oh, AI.
I want to start though with a year in headline. A few of us put out, some asks into the community on social and asked listeners if they could sum up the year in a headline. So these are my finalists. First one, top 10 reason this simulation needs to be rebooted.
Mm-hmm.
Just a clip of Tim Robinson screaming, what the soft landings as a service, SLAS. And finally, Rise of the Broligarchs.
Ooh, I like that one.
Rise of the Broligarchs is pretty good. I think we can go with that because that's very it's even nonpartisan. Isn't that nice?
It is.
It feels more pointed and tech specific than maybe some of the earlier ones, which I liked a lot, like just Tim Robinson screaming. That sounds about right, but maybe that's true every year.
The right vibe, but it's not quite the right phrasing.
So the winner is OK Slacker. So good for you.
Good handle, too.
Good for you. Well, we should move on to some deals, or shall I say no deals. Margaux, I'm going to kick this to you. Let's talk about the people behind the deals. What the hell happened to VCs this year?
Yeah, we touched on it last episode, but it's definitely been kind of a revolving door. We've seen big exits from Andreessen Horowitz. We've seen just like a week or two ago, Brian Singerman was taking a step back from Founders Fund. Venture is just super weird this year. I was looking at the stats, and on one hand, you have 25% of the VC investors that were active last year have paused deals this year. So you've got a bunch of zombie funds around, which means funds that aren't deploying capital, can't raise new capital, and are kind of just letting their current investments ride out. And then on the other hand, you have the rise of these massive mega funds. We saw General Catalyst raise $8 billion, Andreessen Horowitz raise $7.2 billion. It's a very uneven narrative. I was talking to VC this morning who was going out and raising for another fund, and I asked him what it's like right now, and he said it's getting easier. It was cold as ice a year ago, and it's changing dramatically. We might be headed towards yet another bubble. There's something to think about for 2025.
Sounds awesome start to 2025.
I know, is that good news or I don't know.
Well, if I had a bunch of money, I would definitely be in the wait and see approach during such a year as this last one.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen LPs, every VC has talked about how LPs are asking for liquidity and there has not really been any. So it makes sense they don't want to hand over more.
It does seem like a sort of a period where like just very distinct winners and losers, which you'd think that VC would always be that, but it seemed like there was just so much money for a while that everyone was a winner, even if they didn't make any good investments. And that is maybe changing. But then also you're just seeing these like giant firms just pump crazy amounts of money into just a handful of deals, which doesn't seem super healthy either. So I don't know. It seems bad.
Right. 2025 is really like, seems bad. I feel like that might be the theme, but it's not. I swear there's going to be good stuff. One of the things that there was a lot of hype about early on in the year that didn't quite really pan out was hype around IPOs. Would this be the year, after COVID that, things came back? And we definitely didn't see the same turnout as was expected, but there were a few, I think, highlights. On the transportation front, the two big ones were Pony AI and Zeekr. And the one thing I want to note about that is these are two Chinese companies. And this matters because really they were the first two, Zeekr being the first one, transportation related companies, but a little bit different sectors. Pony AI, autonomous driving, Zeekr, EV startup-esque. But these were the first ones that was a listing by a Chinese company since 2021, following the country's effective ban on foreign IPOs. So that's what got my notice. And they both did pretty well. I mean, Pony AI debuted with a $5.25 billion valuation, and Zeekr shares shot up 38% on their market debut. So those were on my radar. Outside of transportation, there was Service Titan, which was more recent. But then I guess the one of note was Reddit.
Well, Service Titan, I know we've talked about in the last few weeks, and that I guess that hasn't quite happened yet. But that does seem like an example of a lot of pressure from LPs to get some sort of liquidity. And so even if it's not going to be a rousing success, as an IPO necessarily. I mean, who knows? I'm terrible at predicting anything about the public markets, except that they're always crazy. But it seems like, yeah, that's not going to be like this amazing triumphant moment. And I guess in general, yeah, it just seems like the companies going public right now have like a bunch of asterisks by their name for whatever reason.
Yeah. Talking about unpredictability, I would say the one thing that we probably could have predicted was a couple of years ago when the whole meme stock craze was going on and SPACs were everywhere, that some of these seemed a little bit weird in that they didn't have revenue even, and they probably weren't going to survive. And we saw a bit of that play out, at least in the transportation world, where a bunch of EV SPACs died. Fisker being one, they did have revenue. Arrival, another one. And Canoe is still existing, but sort of barely hanging on. So to me, 2024 was more playing out some of the hype that happened a couple of years prior with the SPACs. And these were like some of the last ones. There was a bunch of failures in 2023, and 2024 was the last of that. The other big thing was that more seemed to be opting for M&A as opposed to going public. And probably one of the big ones that didn't happen was Wiz turning down a $23 billion acquisition offer from Google. And then they went on and like just made their own acquisition, right?
Well, I guess as you talk about also that broader M&A landscape, I think the founder of Wiz has talked about this a little bit, about just sort of decision making, about wanting to go big and, independent company, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing I'm wondering about is, when you talk about a deal of that scale, obviously the antitrust environment around Google or Amazon or Meta making any significant acquisition has been pretty tough. So you can also imagine like the founders of Wiz thinking, well, maybe this deal is just going to like sit in like various kinds of regulatory review for the next year anyway. So is this even actually going to go through, or are we going to like try to do this and then it's all going to fall apart in a year?
Yeah, totally. I did want to mention two other stories that don't really fall into the other categories that we have. One is the WordPress drama that occurred, and the other was the CrowdStrike fallout. And it just seems like that was so long ago, but it really wasn't. It was just earlier this summer. We had a lot of coverage around CrowdStrike, but Margaux, you were actually flying home during CrowdStrike.
Yeah, it rocked because I was on Spirit, which wasn't impacted. So I was just sitting in the airport, having a glass of wine, feeling better than everyone for the first time for flying Spirit. It was an awesome experience. 10 out of 10.
Dude, how about I dodged it and then I flew like the next month or later that month, and Port of Seattle had its own like ransomware or something hacked.
Ooh.
So I missed the CrowdStrike, fracas, and then I went and had a totally shut down airport when I flew that was just specifically targeted at me and the other 50,000
Wow.
people who were
Maybe
there.
it's like Final Destination. Like you
Oh my God.
were meant to be in that hack.
Interesting. Well, Anthony, you did a lot of coverage, and I'm wondering if there's a theme here. I mean, are people have this sense in 2024 that just everything is vulnerable? As you were covering CrowdStrike and also reading about our coverage on other ransomware attacks, what's your thoughts on that?
I think it was that everything is vulnerable, but also CrowdStrike in particular, but also the Port of Seattle hack, they underlined, I think a lot of times when we see hacks, it's like, oh, maybe like my Facebook password or something got taken by hackers, which, actually is a pretty big deal and something you should respond to. But this was showing like, it was all these things that we don't think of as tech, although maybe Kirsten, you do, because many of them are transportation related, but having basically the computers go down and the networks go down, for trains, for airports, for all these different things, it sort of revealed this vulnerability that's not just websites or the internet, but basically, the infrastructure of our modern society can collapse if somebody makes a bad decision with their security infrastructure.
That's why we should hand it over to the AIs, Anthony.
That's right. Yeah. Sometimes people are just like, things are bad, and so let's just let AI handle it. And I'm sure nothing could possibly go wrong that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I did mention the WordPress drama. Anthony, you did a little bit of coverage of that.
Yes, I did. It's one of those things where as long as something bad happened on the weekend, I did a little bit of coverage on it.
Well, I was going to say, Yvonne had a WordPress drama explained story that was in November that I think is a pretty good overview. And then, of course, we had
Matt Mullenweg.
Yeah, Matt Mullenweg at Disrupt. Thank you. And this is still going on, though, right? Like this drama is continuing. It's not going to be wrapped up by the end of the year.
No, it seems like it's still simmering. I was definitely trying to like catch up on the coverage before we recorded. There have been cease and desist letters going in both directions, but it seems like there is going to be continuing fallout into 2025.
All right, we've got a theme going on here.
It gets worse.
Lots to look forward to for 2020. We should pivot though, and after the break, we're going to talk about our favorite startups.
It's time banking did more than hold your money. Now it can. With Mercury, you can pay bills in seconds, close the books faster, and even send invoices. Not only does Mercury do away with a patchwork of tools, it eliminates guesswork, giving you complete and accurate visibility into your business finances, all from one account. Apply in minutes at mercury.com.
The TC team got together and picked some of their favorite startups. Margaux, I'd love to get your take on if there were any trends within this long list and what you and the rest of the team did in terms of how they picked the startups for this list.
Yeah, so we all picked, I think it was 5 startups that we had been following that we thought were really exciting. I think it will come as no surprise that AI was a huge theme. We had Poolside, which we talked about on this very podcast, which is a coding co-pilot startup. They reportedly raised around 400 million. We had a few other AI startups, but honestly, Devin's going to talk so much about AI later that I'm going to talk about something else now. For me, and I'm not just saying this because I love writing about defense tech, but there was a lot of defense tech and space tech or like gov tech on the list that I thought was really cool. Saronic Technologies is one of the newest like defense unicorns. And we've reached a kind of cool moment in defense tech that I feel like Saronic kind of encapsulates, which is that Anduril is big enough and has been going on for long enough to start defense tech companies that kind of ride off of Anduril technology or like in their orbit, just like we had with SpaceX, which is how we got a big, obviously, space tech boom. So yeah, Saronic can go and do missions for the military, and they raise 175 million Series B. And then the second company that I really loved that I've talked to their team a ton is Varda Space, which are making like in-space pharmaceuticals. And they actually successfully manufactured a drug in space and got it back to Earth safely. So 2 very cool companies, lots of defense tech, good year for my beat.
Well, I'll be interesting to see if the same pace happens in 2025, because 2024, it seemed like every company was suddenly dual use, including in my sector. And these companies weren't on the list, but I did want to mention them just because they fall in an interesting category of serial entrepreneur where the last gig didn't totally go super awesome. So I want to call out those 2. One is Shouty Ho has a new self-driving truck startup called Bot Auto. And he's important because he was one of the co-founders of Too Simple, which was a self-driving truck startup that is now delisted and has moved to China. So that didn't really go awesome. And then the other person was Kyle Vogt, who was a co-founder of Cruise. And he resigned in December after a lot of drama with the company, which I'm not going to get into because we don't have a lot of time. But he's back with The Bot Company, which is a home robotics company. So those are 2 startups that I'm actually going to be paying a lot more attention to in 2025, but absolutely had to call them out. Anthony and Devin?
I'll say in general, I really like being on the boat beat and covering all these electric boat startups like Candela and Zinn and Navier. Like I've just been covering them because I think it's cool. Like I get to hang out by a lake in the summer here in Seattle, Lake Union, and it is such a nasty, dirty lake. If you replaced all the dirty, dirty boats with electric boats, it would be 10,000 times cleaner and quieter. And they're already doing that in a lot of places. They're trying to make that change. So I appreciate that. And I just love the idea of having one myself sometime. I mean, not like a big one, but like a rowboat with an electric motor on the back or something like that.
I guess for mine, so just a little bit of behind the scenes. I was talking to our producer before we started recording, and I was like, is Blue Sky too obvious? Does that count as a startup? And I was given permission. So I'm going to go with Blue Sky as my favorite startup of the year. And I just think it's been really exciting and inspiring to see all the growth, in the last month or so, even if maybe that's responding to some, macro stuff that doesn't necessarily have to do with Blue Sky itself. And I think it also is in this very interesting position right now where up until, those kind of 2 big growth spurts around Brazil, and then I guess more noticeably for me around the US election, it really felt like it was small enough to be a very distinct community. And maybe that was just an illusion, but it felt that way of like everybody kind of was like, had sort of similar ideas about how to interact with each other. There was like, a defined political spectrum. And I think now it's getting much bigger, much less defined. So I'm like very curious to see how it tries to preserve, to what extent it tries to preserve that identity now that it has, like 25 million users.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Like I got onto Blue Sky quite some time ago, and it was really like a posting site, right? And it was a very specific community. And I would dare to say like a pretty anti-tech community for sure. But that's changed, and it is changing, and it continues to change. And I've seen that just based on, there's still that element there for sure. But when you have such an influx of people coming on, all trying to figure out the rules right now and the culture of Blue Sky, it's really interesting to watch this evolve. And I'm wondering if a year from now, when we're talking about Blue Sky, like what it's going to look like.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. I will say that, as somebody who's been a long time lurker on Blue Sky, but posts very rarely, the one thing I will complain about is that if you just join Blue Sky, don't immediately start complaining about it and saying it should be more like Twitter, because I don't think that's the point.
Message received. And I haven't complained, in case you're talking about me.
Yeah, I was looking directly at you, Kirsten.
Well, we should close this show by talking about AI advancement. And of course, Devin, you are the best positioned person to talk about this. And I want to start by asking you, in your mind, like so much happened this year around AI, but what were some of the most interesting advancements that cut through the hype? Because the hype was the big part of the story. But I'm wondering if there's some specific advancements that you can point to that happened in 2024 that are notable.
It's really hard to say because the companies that make AI have been so scattershot in their approaches because nobody really knows what AI is actually capable of. They can make lots of big claims, but no one really knows until it goes out in production to thousands or millions of people. And so you've had all the big companies from, Google and Microsoft to OpenAI and Anthropic just putting stuff out there and then being like, oh, that didn't work very well. Or maybe something that works very well. Google tried AI, additions to search and fell on its face immediately. And everybody was like, wow, this is terrible. But then Perplexity is doing better with that, with this kind of like shotgun approach that's probably burning money, but they're trying out all these different things. And OpenAI is kind of finding a middle road. But no one has made, as far as I can tell, nobody has made any winning plays except for in a few narrow areas like code assistance and in biotech. There are some places where people are like, oh, it has a very specific use case. We know its limitations, and it is used by specialists to do a specific task. At that point, it's still AI, yeah, but it's not the kind of AI that's been hyped up with like super intelligence or anything like that. It's a tool. It's a software tool like anything else, and they've found a couple of niches where it works.
Would you say that maybe you could put your predictive hat on a little bit? Because a lot of money went into AI. $6.6 billion for OpenAI, $4 billion for Anthropic, $6 billion for XAI. And I'm wondering, based on all of that happened in 2024, if you think that this pace will continue. Like, will it get even more insane than it did in 2024?
Personally, I don't think so. I think that those giant rounds are probably the last of that scale, at least for these companies in this sort of phase of AI. I think this is kind of like look, if you can't do it with $6 billion, no one's going to do it with any amount of money. Like with a 5-year head start, already you have billions and you get a bunch more money. At some point, investors are going to say like, look, we got to use what we got here. We can't keep throwing money into this pit. The pit is not filling up. We are already seeing that those investments are giving us diminishing returns for all the compute and, data we're putting into them. We're getting less and less. So they're trying new stuff. And when they say, oh, well, it's the reasoning models that are actually the next step, we need to power those. And then they're like, oh, no, it's actually the world models that'll produce the real value. And they're like, oh, no, but we need the agents that are able to interact. So we'll need to build that out. And it's just like they keep moving the goalposts further and further down the field and spending so much money. They're creating interesting things, but at some point you have to be a business, right?
So is 2025, is that the year that they're all going to try to actually make money?
I had hoped that 2024 would be. I think that they will because they because of the scaling laws that they're running up against, like they're not able to just add more compute to make more capabilities. So I think 2025 is going to be the year when they actually have to make do with what they have. They actually have to take the toy box that they have filled up and play with those toys.
Yeah, it feels like they're in this trap of, on the one hand, that given how much money they've raised, the only success that will be a real success for their investors is like completely changing the world. And also, while they're like pursuing those kind of grand ambitions, they also have to make it a viable business and see those costs go down. And sort of trying to make both of those things happen seems like a pretty tall order.
It is. I mean, I'm not optimistic about the business outlook. I think that there'll be interesting companies to follow, but I don't see another, giant extension the way that we've seen this year. And they keep saying it's going to be even more expensive to do what we wanted to do. Like they just released Sora, the video model, right? OpenAI did. That's going to be so expensive to run. It was so expensive to create. There's going to be all kinds of copyright issues. It's just another can of worms. They're just dumping the worms out on the ground and being like, somewhere among all these cans of worms, there's a golden worm.
Okay, so to continue with the worm analogy, is there room for any new worms? We hear, of course, about those that dominate, like OpenAI, but is there room in the startup sector for AI-focused startups to have maybe niche products that actually have a chance of carving out some market share and maybe even making revenue?
It's totally possible, but that's the kind of thing that those $6 billion are to prevent. Like OpenAI is not just spending $6 billion on, data centers and XAI and everything. Like, do you want to make the AI tweet deck for Twitter? No, X is going to do that. Elon Musk is going to make sure no one takes his toys away. And the same with OpenAI. They're going to be building out the kinds of products that they expect their customers are already building. They have all that data. When you build a product based on the OpenAI API, they know everything about that, and they can essentially sort of Sherlock you the way that Apple does, So I think it's actually going to be a very dangerous time for new AI startups, mid-size AI startups. If they're in a good niche, I think they'll live and maybe get bought. I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation too. It's going to be a very, very business positive administration, to say the least. So I think we're going to see a lot less antitrust worries and a lot more, let's snap them up and make sure they don't come yapping at our heels.
Well, and that, putting aside the antitrust piece, I mean, I've seen that cycle happen in other sectors as well. And one that hasn't hit the same level of hype. But at the time, I thought it was the hypiest thing I had encountered, which was around self-driving vehicles. And you saw that happen where all the mid-tier companies, if they didn't make it or find themselves a very specific niche, even after pivoting, they've all been consolidated or folded. And it seems like I'm seeing a larger scale version of this play out already in 2024, but really in 2025, I think you're right that we're going to see that accelerate.
I agree.
That's the perfect way to end this. So I want to thank my co-hosts, and not Anthony Michael Hall, by the way, to bring it full circle, but Anthony Ha, thank you.
That's me.
Margaux and Devin, thanks for joining the show today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And Equity will be back in the new year, but until then, you can find Equity under the handle @EquityPod on X and Threads. See y'all next year.
Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. Bryce Durbin is our illustrator, and we'd like to give a big thanks to our audience development team and Henry Pickavett, who manages TechCrunch audio products. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.